The storm took out 4 shingles on the north slope of her roof at 11 minutes past midnight, and by the time I'd pulled on boots and a jacket over a t-shirt, water was already finding its way into the room above her kitchen. I expected to find her on the phone with an emergency repair line, reciting an account number to someone who didn't care. I did not expect to find her standing in the hallway in a rain-spotted cardigan, holding a flashlight that had stopped working, laughing, actually laughing, at the absurdity of it. "The universe has opinions about my roof," she said. 40 minutes later, the worst of it had passed. She looked at me, and then at the door, and said the thing that would not leave me alone for the rest of that week. "Stay tonight. I don't want to be alone." My name is Daniel Vance. I'm 34. I restore furniture for a living. Chairs mostly, the kind with joints that have outlived the people who built them, and I work alone in a shop that smells permanently of linseed oil and sawdust. I'd lived for 2 years in the converted carriage house behind Margaret Calloway's place, paying rent into an envelope I left under her kitchen door on the 1st of every month, and in that time we had developed the specific, careful politeness of 2 people who decided not to need each other. Her name was Margaret. Maggie, if you'd earned it. Which I hadn't. Not yet. She kept a tin of finishing nails on the kitchen windowsill that had belonged to her husband, half rusted, useless for anything except sitting there. She wore his old flannel work jacket when she did anything outside, sleeves rolled twice because he'd been taller. She had the kind of competence that didn't ask for witnesses. She mowed her own lawn, cleared her own gutters, and answered "I've got it" to any offer of help in a tone that ended the conversation before it started. We'd met when I answered her listing for the carriage house 2 years back, and she'd interviewed me on her porch for 40 minutes about woodworking, before mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that her husband had died 18 months earlier in an accident on a road she still wouldn't drive down. She'd told herself, I think, that the renting was practical, extra income, a second set of eyes on the property. She had not told herself that maybe she just didn't want the house to be quite so quiet. She ran the house the way she ran everything else, competently on her own terms, with a faint and permanent refusal to be managed by anyone, including grief. She kept Tom's tools in the garage, organized, oiled, untouched. She still set the porch light on a timer he'd installed, because changing it felt like erasing something she wasn't ready to erase. I noticed these things the way you notice the furniture in a house you visit often. Present, unremarked on, slowly becoming part of how you understood the person who lived there. I didn't think anything of noticing. That, too, turned out to be the wrong way to read myself. The storm announced itself the way they do in early autumn, a smell of ozone and wet asphalt sliding in under a sky that had been too still for too long, and then wind that found every gap in the carriage house siding and made the whole building exhale. I'd been awake reading. I heard the first crack of something giving way on her roofline a little after 11, sharp and wrong, the sound dry things make when they tear. I crossed the yard in the dark with a flashlight that worked, and a ladder I didn't bother asking permission to bring. 4 shingles had peeled clean off the north slope above her kitchen, and water was already finding the seam, dripping steady through a stain spreading across her ceiling like something deciding to exist. She met me at the door before I knocked, hair flattened on one side from a pillow, the ruined flashlight still in her hand. And for the length of one long breath I watched her run the calculations she always ran. "I've got it. I don't need this. I can manage." And then, for the first time in 2 years, not finish them. "The ladder's already wet," she said, which was not a no. We worked for 40 minutes in weather that had no business letting 2 people stand on a roof, me securing a tarp over the gap while she held the flashlight steady from the kitchen window below and called out wind direction like she'd done this before, because she had with someone else a long time ago. When I came back down soaked through, she had a towel ready and didn't ask if I wanted one. She just held it out. That was the first fracture, not the roof. Her handing me a towel like it was something she'd been doing for years instead of something she'd never once let happen. I had never seen her not wait to be asked. We stood in her kitchen afterward, both dripping onto a floor that had clearly seen worse, and the silence that followed wasn't the practiced kind we usually kept between us. It was a different silence, the kind that's actually a conversation, just one neither of us had started yet. "You should go change," she said. Then, before I'd reached the door, quieter, like she was testing whether the sentence would survive being said out loud, or "You could stay." "I don't." She stopped. Started again. "I don't want to be alone tonight." Not after that. It landed somewhere specific. I stayed. Not in the way the word might suggest to people who weren't there. I took the couch. She took her room, and in the morning we ate toast, standing up at her counter like the night before had been ordinary, which it very deliberately was not. I told myself this was just what you did for a neighbor in a storm. Anyone would have brought a ladder. Anyone would have stayed when asked. I had a whole inventory of reasonable explanations, each one load bearing on its own and collectively holding up nothing at all. It wasn't the roof. I knew that within about 4 days. It was the towel. It was the way she'd said "not after that" instead of just "no, I'm fine," which was the sentence she'd had ready for 2 years. I started finding reasons to be in the yard when she came home from work. I started noticing what time her kitchen light came on. None of this struck me as significant at the time, which is, I've come to understand, exactly how significant things announce themselves. The evidence arrived in pieces, the way it always does, none of them conclusive on their own. The first piece came 2 weeks later, through her kitchen window, which she'd left open to the evening air without accounting for how clearly sound travels across a yard. She was on the phone with her sister. "No. He's just the tenant," she said, in the tone of someone repeating something she'd said enough times that it had started to sound like a lie even to her. A pause. Then, quieter, like she'd forgotten the window was open at all. "I don't know. I notice when his light's on now. That's new." The second piece came from her neighbor Carol, who flagged me down at the mailbox to thank me for fixing the roof, and then, unprompted, said she hasn't talked about anyone like she talks about you since Tom, and then looked immediately like she regretted it, the way people do when they've said a true thing out loud by accident. I am not a man with reliable instincts about what to do with information like that. I filed it under probably nothing and went back to work on a chair with a leg that wouldn't sit flush, which felt, at the time, like the more honest use of my attention. The third piece was smaller and harder to dismiss. I'd brought back her ladder, set it against the garage, and found her on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, one of them apparently for me, though she hadn't said so out loud. She'd just poured it and left it where I'd reach for it, without thinking. When I sat down, her hand was resting near the tin of nails she'd brought outside for no reason I could identify, and when I asked about it, her fingers closed around it once, then released it, like she'd caught herself doing something private in front of a witness. "It's nothing," she said, "just sentimental." She didn't look at me when she said it. The fourth piece I almost missed entirely. The 3rd week of October was the anniversary of Tom's accident. I knew this only because Carol had mentioned it once. In passing, the way people mention things they think you should be prepared for. I didn't say anything to Margaret about it. I just made sure, that evening, to be in the yard splitting wood that didn't urgently need splitting, in case she wanted company that wasn't a question. She came out around dusk with 2 mugs of tea, didn't say why, and sat on the porch step while I worked, not talking, just present. And when I finally sat down beside her, she said, "You didn't ask me how I was doing today, not as a complaint." I noticed, she added, and didn't explain further, and didn't need to. The 5th piece, I wasn't supposed to see at all. Her phone was face up on the porch railing when a text came through from her sister. "Did you tell him yet?" And she turned it face down so fast the motion itself was the answer. I did not have good instincts about exits where Margaret Calloway was concerned. I had, however, a fully developed talent for pretending I hadn't seen things I had very much seen, and for 2 more weeks I deployed it like a professional. It was a Sunday in October when the actual turn happened, and almost nothing was said during it. She was up on a stepladder in her side yard, restringing a string of porch lights that had failed sometime over the summer, and I was nearby pretending the fence needed attention it did not need. The afternoon had that particular low gold light that only shows up for about 3 weeks a year, slanting long across the grass, and somewhere 2 yards over someone was burning leaves, the smoke catching in the last of the warmth. She had flour on her sleeve from baking earlier and hadn't noticed, or had noticed and didn't care, which told you something about which kind of person she actually was underneath the managed one. I held the ladder. She didn't ask me to. I just walked over and put my hand on it, and she glanced down once, registered what I was doing, and kept working without comment, which from her was its own kind of agreement. We stayed like that for the better part of 20 minutes. Her testing bulbs, me steadying a ladder that didn't especially need steadying, the smoke and the gold light, and neither of us saying anything, because there wasn't for once anything that needed managing between us. It was the first time in 2 years the silence between Margaret and me hadn't been doing any work. It had just been quiet. When she came down, she stood close enough that I could smell wood smoke and flour, and something underneath that was just her. And she looked at the lights, not at me, and said the first true thing either of us had risked since the storm. "I started leaving the porch light on," she said, "before I knew why I was doing it. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't close to one. But it was the first sentence either of us had said in 2 years that wasn't doing the job of keeping the other person at the correct, careful distance, and something in my understanding of the afternoon quietly rearranged itself around it. There was one evening, early December, when I came close to ruining the whole careful architecture of it. We were sitting on her back steps, both of us cold, and neither of us willing to be the one who suggested going inside, and she was telling a story about Tom that ended, unexpectedly, in a laugh instead of the silence these stories usually ended in. It was the first time I'd heard her talk about him like that, like a person she'd loved instead of a wound she was managing, and something about being trusted with that nearly undid all my careful restraint at once. I opened my mouth to say something I had no real plan for. What came out instead was, "I think the furniture in this room is load-bearing," which made absolutely no sense since we were outside, and she laughed so hard she had to put her tea down, and the moment passed without either of us having to do anything about it yet. Later, lying in the carriage house, I understood what had actually happened. I'd been about half a second from telling her everything, and some better calibrated part of me had recognized that the moment wasn't hers yet, that this whole thing only worked if she got there first, on her own schedule, without me standing in the doorway holding it open. So I'd said something about load-bearing furniture instead. Margaret Calloway deserved better instincts in the man living 40 feet from her kitchen, and I was, for once, glad I had them anyway. The weeks after that kept closing the distance between us in small, deniable increments. She started leaving her door unlocked on the nights I worked late in the shop, which she would have called practical if I'd asked, and I never asked. I started bringing over the kind of bread that takes too long to make for one person, and she started keeping a second coffee mug on the counter that wasn't strictly mine, except that it always, somehow was. Neither of us named any of it. Naming it felt like it would end something we were both, separately, trying to keep alive a little longer. I caught myself once, mid-November, standing in my own shop holding a chisel I had no memory of picking up, having spent the last 10 minutes thinking entirely about the exact sound her laugh made when it was real instead of managed. That is not a feeling. That is a feeling with better paperwork, and I had by then stopped being able to convincingly file the paperwork anywhere else. The night it finally happened, there was no storm. That seemed important later, when I thought back on it, that the roof had only ever been the door, not the reason. The actual reason needed no weather at all. It needed a Tuesday, a pot of soup she'd made too much of on purpose, and the kind of ordinary evening that gives two careful people nowhere left to hide behind. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and the specific kind of quiet that happens right before someone says something they've been carrying for a while. She'd made too much soup on purpose. I understood that days later, when I had time to notice the math of it. 4 servings for 2 people who both lived alone, and we ate it standing at her counter the way we'd eaten toast the morning after the storm, like ordinary was a costume we both still knew how to put on. She set her spoon down first. "I stopped telling people you were just my tenant about a month ago," she said, not looking up from the counter. I kept not correcting it when they assumed something else. And then, somewhere in there, I stopped wanting to. I went very still. Not dramatically. Nothing about that kitchen suggested drama was an option, but something in my chest did the thing it does when the floor turns out to be a slightly different shape than you'd been standing on. I looked at her, then at the tin of nails on the windowsill, then back at her, because apparently my body needed a moment to consult the room before deciding how to respond. "You don't have to finish that," I said. "If you want this to go back to being whatever it was an hour ago, I won't mention it again." I mean that. It cost me something to say it and offer her the door anyway. But the door had to be real, or none of this meant anything. She didn't take it. "I don't want it to go back," she said. And for the first time in 2 years, her voice didn't have the managed steadiness in it, just something quieter and more exposed. "I've wanted it to be exactly this for longer than I've been willing to say. I just didn't know how to want something again without feeling like I was doing something wrong by Tom. And then you fixed my roof in the middle of the night and didn't make it about anything. And I realized I'd been waiting for permission that was never going to arrive on its own. So I'm giving it to myself." Tonight, it hit harder than I had given it permission to. "Every piece of good news I've had in the last 2 years," I said, "you were the first person I thought to tell." I told myself that was just what neighbors do. It isn't. I stopped thinking of the carriage house as where I live about the same time you stopped calling me your tenant. I started thinking of it as where you are. She didn't say anything to that. She crossed the kitchen instead. The distance that had taken 2 years to close, covered in about 4 seconds, and put her hand against my jaw the way you'd confirm something was actually real before you let yourself believe it. I kissed her like a man who had been offered an exit and was profoundly relieved she hadn't taken it. Careful, then less careful. Her hand fisting once in my shirt like she was making sure of something. Her phone alarm went off on the counter behind her, the one she set every night for a 6 a.m. Neither of us was going to honor properly the next morning, and she started laughing into my shoulder, and I started laughing too, because apparently the universe still had opinions about timing. and neither of us minded. 6 weeks later, we were still in the stage where every small thing felt like it required care. She still knocked on the carriage house door instead of just walking in, and I still left the porch light on for her even on nights she said she wasn't coming over. Just in case the math changed. We were learning the specific tenderness of two careful people who had finally stopped being careful with each other. And it was, in its way, slower and better than anything dramatic could have been. By the time spring arrived, none of that careful learning was left. She corrected my grammar without thinking about it, the way she always had, except now. I'd lean over and kiss the side of her head when she did it instead of arguing back, and she'd swat me away and keep grading my sentences anyway. The tin of nails moved from the windowsill to a small shelf by the door. Not hidden, not displayed, just there, the way the past sits comfortably next to a present it isn't competing with. I never asked her to choose between missing him and loving me. She never made me feel like I was supposed to. 2 years on, when people ask how it started, she tells them I fixed her roof. I tell them she let me. We're both telling the truth, just from different floors of the same house. Nothing had appeared from nowhere. It had simply stopped being ignored. What would you have done if your landlord asked you to stay the night she shouldn't have had to spend alone? And have you ever realized, too late to pretend you hadn't, that the person you'd been quietly taking care of had been taking care of you back the whole time? Leave your answer in the comments. If this one stayed with you, a like and a subscribe means I'll keep making them, and I'll see you in the next one.